Day 5, Early World, Genesis 10 through 11, Psalm 2, let's begin. Genesis 10:11. These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and of the sons who were born to them after the great flood. The sons of Japheth were Gomer, and Magog, and Madai, and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshech, and Tiras. And then the sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz, and Riphath, and Togarmah. And the sons of Javan were Elisha, and Tarshish, Kittim, and Rodanim. The islands of the Gentiles were divided by these into their regions, each one according to his tongue, and their families and their nations. And the sons of Ham were Cush, and Mizraim, and Put, and Canaan. And the sons of Cush were Seba, and Havilah, and Sabta, and Ramah, and Sabteka. The sons of Ramah were Sheba and Dedan. And then Cush conceived Nimrod. He began to be powerful on the earth. And he was an able hunter before the Lord. From this, a proverb came forth, just like Nimrod, an able hunter before the Lord. And so, the beginning of his kingdom was Babylon, and Erech, and Akkad, and Shelan in the land of Shinar. From that land Assur came forth, and he built Nineveh, and the streets of the city, and Calah. And also Rezin, between Nineveh and Calah. This is a great city. And truly, Mizraim conceived Ludim, and Anamim, and Lehabim, Naphtuhim. And Pathrusim and Casluim, from whom came forth the Philistines and the Caphtorim. Then Canaan conceived Sidon his firstborn, the Hittite, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, the Girgashite, the Hivite, and the Archite, the Sinite, and the Arvadian, the Samorite, and the Hamathite. And after this, the peoples of the Canaanites became widespread. And the borders of Canaan went, as one travels, from Sidon to Gerar, even to Gaza, until one enters Sodom and Gomorrah, and from Admah and Zeboim, even to Lisa. These are the sons of Ham and their kindred, and tongues, and generations, and lands, and nations. Likewise, from Shem, the father of all the sons of Heber, the elder brother of Japheth, sons were born. The sons of Shem were Elam, and Ashur, and Arphaxad, and Lud, and Aram. The sons of Aram were Uzi, and Hul, and Gether, and Mash. But truly, Arphaxad conceived Shelah, from whom was born Eber. And to Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth became divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. This Joktan conceived Almodad, and Sheleph, and Hazarmaveth, Jerah, and Hadaram, and Uzal, and Diklah, and Obal, and Abimael, Sheb, and Ophir, and Havilah, and Jobab. All these were the sons of Joktan. And their habitation extended from Mesa, as one sojourns, even to Sephar, a mountain in the east. These are the sons of Shem according to their kindred, and tongues, and the regions within their nations. These are the families of Noah, according to their peoples and nations. The nations became divided according to these, on the earth after the great flood. Now the earth was of one language and of the same speech. And when they were advancing from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt in it. And each one said to his neighbor, Come, let us make bricks, and bake them with fire. And they had bricks instead of stones, and pitch instead of mortar. And they said, Come, let us make a city and a tower, so that its height may reach to heaven. And let us make our name famous before we are divided into all the lands. Then the Lord descended to see the city and the tower, which the sons of Adam were building. And he said, Behold, the people are united, and all have one tongue. And since they have begun to do this, they will not desist from their plans, until they have completed their work. Therefore, come, let us descend, and in that place confound their tongue, so that they may not listen, each one to the voice of his neighbor. And so the Lord divided them from that place into all the lands, and they ceased to build the city. And for this reason, its name was called Babel, because in that place the language of the whole earth became confused. And from then on, the Lord scattered them across the face of every region. These are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old when he conceived Arphaxad, 2 years after the great flood. And after he conceived Arphaxad, Shem lived for 500 years, and he conceived sons and daughters. Next, Arphaxad lived for 35 years, and then he conceived Shelah. And after he conceived Shelah, Arphaxad lived for 303 years, and he conceived sons and daughters. Likewise, Shelah lived for 30 years, and then he conceived Eber. And after he conceived Eber, Shelah lived for 403 years, and he conceived sons and daughters. Then Eber lived for 34 years, and he conceived Peleg. And after he conceived Peleg, Eber lived for 430 years, and he conceived sons and daughters. Likewise, Peleg lived for 30 years, and then he conceived Reu. And after he conceived Reu, Peleg lived for 209 years, and he conceived sons and daughters. Then Reu lived for 32 years, and then he conceived Serug. Likewise, after he conceived Serug, Reu lived for 207 years, and he conceived sons and daughters. In truth, Serug lived for 30 years, and then he conceived Nahor. And after he conceived Nahor, Serug lived for 200 years, and he conceived sons and daughters. And so Nahor lived for 29 years, and then he conceived Terah. And after he conceived Terah, Nahor lived for 119 years, and he conceived sons and daughters. And Terah lived for 70 years, and then he conceived Abram, and Nahor, and Haran. And these are the generations of Terah. Terah conceived Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Next Haran conceived Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah, in the land of his nativity, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Then Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. And the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. But Sarai was barren, and had no children. And so Terah took his son Abram, and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and he led them away from Ur of the Chaldeans, to go into the land of Canaan. And they approached as far as Haran, and they dwelt there. And the days of Terah that passed were 205 years, and then he died in Haran. Psalm 2. Why have the Gentiles been seething, and why have the people been pondering nonsense? The kings of the earth have stood up, and the leaders have joined together as one, against the Lord and against his Christ. Let us shatter their chains and cast their yoke away from us. He who dwells in heaven will ridicule them, and the Lord will mock them. Then will he speak to them in his anger, and trouble them with his fury. Yet I have been appointed king by him over Zion, his holy mountain, preaching his precepts. The Lord has said to me, You are my son, this day have I begotten you. Ask of me and I will give to you, the Gentiles for your inheritance, and the ends of the earth for your possession. You will rule them with an iron rod, and you will shatter them like a potter's vessel. And now, O kings, understand. Receive instruction, you who judge the earth. Serve the Lord in fear, and exult in him with trembling. Embrace discipline, lest at any time the Lord might become angry, and you would perish from the way of the just. Though his wrath can flare up in a short time, blessed are all those who trust in him.